Africa speaks back. The voice, the truth, the continent on its own terms.
Africa has spoken. Now pass it on. Subscribe, like, share.
7 a.m. in Ouagadougou. 7 buildings raided at the exact same time. Servers seized, contracts shredded, foreign diplomats put on the next flight out. No warning, no press release, just boots on the ground and a government moving with surgical precision. But this isn't just another crackdown. It's a message, sent straight to Tel Aviv, Paris, Washington, and to every power that's ever treated Africa like a background file. And here's the twist. It didn't come with gunfire or chaos. It came with discipline, silence, and 8 words that would ripple across the continent. Africa is not your blind spot anymore. Before we dive in, I want to hear from you. If your country discovered a foreign network operating in secret, would you want your leaders to act immediately or try to negotiate first? Drop your answer in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. You're watching Africa Speak Back, where we go past the headlines to bring you the real stories shaping the continent. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been with us, you know we don't pull punches. All right, let's set the scene, because what happened next changed more than just Burkina Faso. At 7 a.m. Asaya, the streets were quiet, but the air felt heavier than usual. No sirens, no crowds, just a convoy of matte green trucks pulling off the main road in perfect formation. Soldiers stepped down one by one, their pace steady, their eyes locked forward. They surrounded a 3-story office building that, on paper, was a telecom firm. In reality, it was the first target in a months-long counterintelligence sweep. Inside, officers moved fast, seizing encrypted phones, satellite relay logs, and rows of servers humming with data. None of it was in French or local languages. Most of it was in Hebrew and English. Here's the part that caught even seasoned analysts off guard. This wasn't a raid born from chaos or desperation. It was the execution of a plan years in the making. And the plan didn't just stop with one building. By 9 a.m., 6 more sites across the city had been hit with the same precision. For most people in Ouagadougou, mornings start with market chatter, fresh bread, maybe a neighbor's radio. That morning, routines shifted. Passers-by watched in silence as foreign staff were escorted out under armed guard, not handcuffed, not humiliated, just firmly removed. It's a universal thing. In any country, when the government moves this decisively, people wonder, what else have they known that we didn't? According to officials close to the operation, the targets weren't random. Each one was tied to Israeli defense contractors or cybersecurity firms. Each one a node in a larger network that had quietly harvested data across the Sahel. And each one, until that morning, had operated with minimal interference. There's a trade-off here, Santa. In the US, people often debate whether shutting down a foreign-linked company means losing potential investment or gaining back control of information. In Burkina Faso's case, the choice was made. Sovereignty over convenience. The shift wasn't just in policy, it was in posture. You could see it in the way officers carried the seized equipment. No rush, no shouting, as if they knew this moment would be remembered. And in a way, it already was. That morning, whispers started. In markets, in taxi queues, on the steps of small cafes. The question wasn't if something had changed, it was how far that change would go. And in the hours that followed, the answer began to take shape. Netanyahu didn't see it coming, and neither did most of his own advisors. Within hours of the raids, every defense and surveillance contract involving Israeli firms in Burkina Faso was canceled. No renegotiation, no phased withdrawal. Just an executive order, immediate and final. For a small West African nation to make that move, without first signaling to Paris, Washington, or the African Union, broke every unwritten rule of modern diplomacy. But Traoré didn't seem concerned with rules written somewhere else. If you think about it, most governments, including in the US sometimes, tend to weigh the fallout before acting against a foreign partner. Will investment dry up? Will alliances shift? Will sanctions follow? Burkina Faso flipped that script. The calculation wasn't what do we lose if we do this, it was what do we lose if we don't. By midday, soldiers were overseeing the shutdown of satellite uplinks, border surveillance hubs, and encrypted communication lines once managed by foreign contractors. Residents near those facilities noticed something strange. No chaos, no sudden blackout, just a quiet handover of control. It's the kind of scene where, if you weren't paying attention, you might have missed history happening in real time. The human side of it was even more telling. For years, security in Burkina Faso had been a mix of local forces and foreign technology, a patchwork that often left citizens wondering who really had access to their information. Now, seeing those systems boxed up and loaded onto trucks, many felt a sense of clarity they hadn't experienced before. According to regional analysts, what made this day different wasn't just the expulsion itself, it was the speed. Intelligence operations are usually dismantled over months, sometimes years. Here, it happened before most people had finished their morning coffee. And that raises a quiet question for anyone watching. If a government can act this decisively in one area, what else could they change overnight? Across the capital, the mood was shifting from curiosity to pride. Markets buzzed with speculation. Radio talk shows filled with callers debating what the move meant for Burkina Faso's standing in Africa. Some argued it would bring new respect. Others warned it could bring new enemies. Either way, the decision had already redrawn the country's security map. And that map was about to expand beyond its borders. The announcement came with no build-up, just 8 words that landed harder than most speeches. Traoré stood before the nation, not in uniform, not behind a podium, just a dark shirt and steady eyes. Africa is not your blind spot anymore. Those watching at home didn't need a translator to feel the weight of it. In a region where leaders often speak in cautious, coded language, this was the opposite: blunt, public, and aimed far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Right after those words, he laid out what would be called the Troy Doctrine, a 3-pillar framework that on paper looked like national policy, but in tone sounded like a continental challenge. First, full transparency for foreign investments. No more secret contracts, no exceptions. Second, zero tolerance for undeclared intelligence work. Anyone caught, detained, expelled, and publicly named. Third, African nations sharing intelligence with each other, locking out outside surveillance networks. If you think about it, in the US, a policy like that would be debated in committee for months, maybe years. Here, it was declared in minutes, live on national TV. Some viewers felt a jolt of pride. Others felt the risk. Because for every rule like this, there's a reaction from the powers it targets. And as history shows, those reactions aren't always subtle. The change was visible not just in policy, but in people. A shop owner told local radio he'd never seen politicians talk this openly about foreign interference. A teacher said she felt for the first time her country was setting its own rules instead of inheriting them. That's the thing about moments like this. They reshape what people believe is possible. Whether you see it as bold or reckless, the doctrine left no middle ground. Support it, and you commit to reshaping the balance of power. Oppose it, and you risk being seen as defending the old order. Which side would you pick if it were your country? As the speech ended, you could feel the pause, the kind that comes before a ripple turns into a wave. And that wave was about to cross Burkina Faso's borders. The first aftershocks didn't come from inside Burkina Faso. They came from its neighbors. Within 24 hours, Mali froze all imports of Israeli military technology. Guinea suspended its joint cybersecurity initiatives with foreign partners. In Niger, a commission was formed to investigate infrastructure projects tied to outside surveillance. It wasn't coordinated on paper, but it looked like it. One move in Ouagadougou had triggered a chain reaction across the Sahel. Analysts in European capitals started calling it the wall, a growing barrier of resistance, country by country, policy by policy. For people in the region, the shift felt almost overnight. A trader in Bamako told a local reporter he couldn't remember another time when multiple governments acted this quickly on the same issue. In his words, usually they wait to see which way the wind blows. This time, they were the wind. From a distance, it might seem symbolic, but on the ground, there were immediate consequences. Contracts worth millions paused or scrapped. Foreign technical teams packing up equipment. Local agencies stepping in to fill the gap. sometimes improvising with tools they had never fully controlled before. That's the gamble. Choose to cut the cord, and you either build something stronger or you risk the lights going out. The timing made the impact sharper. With security threats in the Sahel already high, many assumed no leader would risk disrupting existing intelligence flows. Yet here was a cluster of governments choosing disruption over dependency. In a way, it exposed a truth people rarely say out loud. Sometimes stability can be the thing that keeps a problem in place. By the week's end, satellite images showed emptied compounds where foreign contractors had once operated. Streets that had been lined with white SUVs now looked like any other stretch of city. The absence was visible, and for some, reassuring. For others, unsettling. And while the region processed that absence, attention was already shifting to how the rest of the world would respond. The silence from Western capitals was almost as loud as the raids themselves. No fiery condemnations, no urgent UN briefings, just a handful of carefully worded statements about dialogue and stability. For governments that normally move quickly to defend a partner's interests, that restraint was telling. In Washington, officials avoided direct comment on the intelligence shutdowns. In Paris, diplomats who once championed Israeli operations in the Sahel kept their heads down. Even Brussels, known for its long press releases, kept its language vague. Inside Burkina Faso, the contrast didn't go unnoticed. People remembered past incidents when far smaller moves had drawn sharp criticism from abroad. Now, a sweeping dismantling of foreign surveillance infrastructure met almost no pushback in public. It left many wondering, was this quiet meant to de-escalate, or was it the sound of strategists regrouping behind closed doors? From a human perspective, the quiet was a double-edged signal. On one hand, it allowed the government to consolidate its changes without immediate foreign pressure. On the other, it meant uncertainty, because when powerful states don't react in public, they often prepare their responses in private. And history shows those responses can be as economic as they are political. In daily life, that uncertainty showed up in small ways. Some business owners delayed orders, unsure if sanctions might follow. Students in international programs asked whether their scholarships would still be honored. It's a common pattern. When the balance shifts suddenly, people start running mental calculations. If the outside funding stops, what fills the gap? If it doesn't, what strings will be attached next time? By the week's midpoint, the foreign media narrative began to split. Some outlets painted the move as a bold stand for sovereignty. Others framed it as a risky turn toward isolation. Both agreed on one thing: the status quo had been broken. And once that happens, the question isn't if the game changes, but how quickly the next piece moves. The changes weren't just on the diplomatic front. They were happening inside Burkina Faso's own institutions. Within days, Traoré's Ministry of State Security launched a full audit of every public-private partnership signed in the past decade. At least 9 senior officials resigned quietly. Others were reassigned, their projects frozen pending review. For a country used to slow, cautious bureaucratic shifts, this pace was almost jarring. Mid-level managers who once had easy access to foreign NGO funding suddenly found themselves explaining every dollar, every clause. And that's where the deeper impact began to show, because accountability, once demanded only from citizens, was now moving upward. In conversations at cafes and markets, people compared it to watching a house get renovated while you're still living in it. Walls being knocked down, floors replaced. Unsettling at first, but revealing where the structure had been weak all along. It's a familiar dynamic anywhere. When the old shortcuts are closed, some will adapt, others will walk away. And in those choices, you see who was there for the mission and who was there for the margin. The political tone was shifting too. Opposition MPs who had once accused Traoré of being reckless were now co-sponsoring a resolution for a national sovereignty review. For many, it was a rare moment where political rivalry took a back seat to a shared cause. If you've lived in a place where partisanship defines every issue, as is often the case in U.S. politics, moments of unity, however brief, tend to stand out. There was also a sense of testing the limits. Could a small West African nation tighten control over its own resources without collapsing under economic pressure? Could it call out foreign influence without closing the door to all outside engagement? Those questions weren't just for Burkina Faso. They echoed in the minds of leaders across the continent. If you've been following this story, you know we've moved from a single operation to a regional shift. But the next chapter would take the conversation beyond Africa's borders and into places that never expected to be part of it. The reaction that surprised observers most didn't come from Africa at all. It came from the African diaspora. In cities like New York, London, and Paris, community groups began holding forums to discuss the Troy Doctrine. Social media timelines filled with clips of Traoré's speech often shared alongside messages about reclaiming identity and resources. For years, diaspora conversations about Africa had often been shaped by distance, pride in heritage mixed with frustration over governance. This time, the tone was different. People weren't just reacting to an event. They were rallying around a model. Commentators in South America drew parallels to their own histories of resisting outside control. Editorials in India and Indonesia framed it as a case study in countering digital colonialism. The overlap of narratives showed how quickly a local decision could become part of a global vocabulary. Inside Burkina Faso, the global echo fed back into daily life. A tailor in Ouagadougou mentioned getting calls from relatives in France who had never before asked about local politics. A university lecturer said his students were bringing in articles from foreign outlets for class debates. It's a reminder that when the outside world starts paying attention, it can shift how a community sees itself. There's an emotional shift that happens when people realize their story is being told on their own terms. According to behavioral research, that recognition can strengthen social cohesion. Or if expectations aren't met, it can lead to disillusionment just as quickly. Here, the balance was fragile. The pride of being noticed came with the weight of maintaining the narrative. As the week went on, the coverage broadened from West Africa's security moves to the deeper question of sovereignty in a connected world. And in that broader lens, Burkina Faso's actions were no longer just a headline. They were a signal that others could choose to answer. It started as a domestic operation, but it ended as a continental marker. In less than a week, Burkina Faso had gone from quietly monitoring foreign-linked networks to dismantling them in full view of the world, and sparking policy shifts far beyond its borders. For intelligence agencies that had operated in Africa with little resistance, the change was abrupt and absolute. Analysts in Tel Aviv began referring to it as the Troy shift, a recalibration of the continent's geopolitical stance driven not by outside powers, but by Africans themselves. Inside Israel's defense establishment, the scramble was immediate. Contingency teams were dispatched to reinforce operations in neighboring states, yet the loss in Burkina Faso was more than physical assets. It was the precedent, proof that a smaller nation could say no, hold its ground, and still maintain internal order. The symbolism carried weight at street level too. In Ouagadougou, murals showed Traoré's silhouette over a map of Africa painted with the words, "We watch back." For some, it was art. For others, it was a declaration. Either way, it marked a shift in how people imagined their role in the larger system. Sociologists often note that when communities see decisive action succeed, it resets their baseline for what's possible. Before this, rejecting an entrenched foreign network without chaos seemed unlikely. Now it was part of lived reality. But that shift came with its own edge. If one country could do it, others might try. And not all would have the same outcome. The gain was sovereignty. The risk was the retaliation history has shown follows such moves. By the time the news cycle began to turn, the memory of that Thursday morning remained vivid. Trucks in formation, offices emptied, a single sentence broadcast across the continent, and in that image, the sense that a long-standing rule had been rewritten, not by negotiation but by action that left no room for misunderstanding. What happened in Burkina Faso wasn't just a headline. It was a case study in how fast the balance of power can shift when a government decides the cost of silence is higher than the cost of action. And while we break these stories down, it's worth saying, this content is based on publicly available reports and analysis. Events in fast-moving situations can develop or be interpreted differently depending on the source. From my point of view, this feels less like an isolated incident and more like a sign of how the conversation around sovereignty is changing, not only in Africa but in any place that's been told to stay in its lane. I'm not saying it's the perfect model, and I'm not predicting what comes next, but I think it's one of those rare moments where the rules people assumed were fixed clearly weren't. So if you want to keep following stories that cut past the usual talking points, Stay tuned for our next news deep dive, because this conversation is far from over.